The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the third time. At 32 years old, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 8 years, following in his grandfather's footsteps who had served during World War II. The weight of tradition pressed heavily on his shoulders, just like the tall bearskin hat that sat perfectly straight on his head. James had always taken immense pride in his role. Standing motionless for hours, maintaining perfect posture and never breaking character, were not just duties to him. They were sacred responsibilities. His fellow guards often joked that he was more statue than man when on duty. The tourists would wave, make funny faces, and sometimes even try to make him laugh, but James remained as still as the ancient stones beneath his polished boots. Today felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the crisp autumn air, or the unusual number of families visiting the castle grounds. As he took his position outside the main entrance, James noticed the excited chatter of children echoing off the historic walls. Their voices mixed, with the clicking of cameras and the shuffle of hundreds of feet on the ancient pathways. The castle had been his second home for nearly a decade. He knew every corner, every stone, and every shadow. More importantly, he understood the delicate balance between maintaining the dignity of his position and serving the public who came to witness this piece of living history. The Queen's Guard was not merely ceremonial. They were active soldiers with real responsibilities, trained to protect both the royal family and the countless visitors who came to experience Britain's heritage. As the morning crowd began to gather, James spotted his relief guard approaching. In exactly 2 hours they would rotate positions, a carefully choreographed dance that had been performed countless times before. But today, something was about to happen that would change not only James's understanding of his role, but also touch the hearts of millions around the world. The first group of tourists approached, led by a guide speaking in enthusiastic tones about the history of the guards. James could hear fragments of the familiar speech about their uniforms, their training, and their unwavering dedication to duty. Children pressed their faces against the barriers, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the tall soldier in his magnificent red coat. Among the crowd, James's trained eye caught sight of something that made his heart skip slightly. A small group was approaching, moving more slowly than the others. He could see wheelchairs and walking aids, and what appeared to be caregivers gently guiding their charges toward the viewing area. His military training had taught him to observe everything, but his human heart was already beginning to stir with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel while on duty. The morning was about to become extraordinary, though James had no way of knowing it yet. As he stood at perfect attention, his rifle held precisely at his side, he was simply another soldier doing his duty. But sometimes duty and compassion could walk hand in hand, even when protocol suggested they should remain forever apart. The autumn breeze rustled through the castle grounds, carrying with it the promise of a day that would be remembered long after the tourists had returned home and the sun had set over the ancient towers of Windsor Castle. The group that had caught James's attention slowly made their way closer to the barriers. He could now see more clearly what had drawn his eye. There were about 15 people in the group, a mix of children and elderly visitors, some in wheelchairs, others using walking frames or being gently supported by caregivers wearing bright blue uniforms that identified them as staff from a local care facility. At the front of the group, a young boy named Tommy sat in his wheelchair, his face beaming with excitement despite the obvious challenges he faced. The 10-year-old had cerebral palsy, which affected his movement and speech, but his eyes sparkled with intelligence and joy as he gazed up at the magnificent guard. His mother, Sarah, walked beside him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder, as she whispered descriptions of everything they were seeing. Behind Tommy, an elderly woman named Margaret clutched her walking frame with shaking hands. At 87, she had dreamed of seeing the Queen's Guard her entire life, having grown up during the war years when such visits seemed impossible. Her granddaughter Emma had arranged this special trip as a surprise for her grandmother's birthday, not knowing how much this moment would mean to both of them. James noticed how the regular tourists began to part, making way for the special needs group with a mixture of kindness and curiosity. The caregivers worked quietly and efficiently, positioning wheelchairs for the best views and helping their charges settle comfortably against the barriers. The excitement was palpable, but James also sensed something else, a deeper appreciation, an understanding that this moment held special significance for these particular visitors. Tommy raised his hand and waved enthusiastically at James, his movements uncoordinated but filled with pure joy. His voice, though difficult to understand, carried clearly across the courtyard as he called out, "Hello, soldier man." His mother quickly shushed him, worried about disturbing the solemn ceremony. But Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious, and several of the other children in the group began waving too. The elderly visitors stood or sat quietly, many with tears in their eyes. For them, the sight of the Queen's Guard represented something profound, a connection to their youth, to their country's history, and to memories of family members who had served in wars long past. Margaret fumbled in her handbag for a handkerchief, overcome with emotion at finally witnessing this piece of living history she had only seen in photographs and on television. James felt something stirring within him that he had never experienced during his 8 years of service. The rigid training that had shaped him into the perfect soldier began to wage a quiet war with his natural human compassion. He had been taught that breaking character, even slightly, was unthinkable. The Queen's Guard represented centuries of tradition, discipline, and unwavering dedication to duty. Yet, as he looked at Tommy's joyful face and Margaret's tearful eyes, he found himself questioning whether true duty might sometimes require a different kind of courage. The tour guide was explaining the significance of the uniform, the bearskin, hat, and the rifle, but James could see that the children and elderly visitors were more interested in the person beneath the ceremonial clothing. They weren't just looking at a tourist attraction. They were seeing a symbol of protection, service, and national pride that resonated deeply with their hearts. As the minutes ticked by, James felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. His training demanded one thing, but his humanity whispered something else entirely. The moment of decision arrived sooner than James had expected. Tommy, in his wheelchair at the front of the group, had been trying to get closer to the barrier for several minutes. His excitement was growing, but his physical limitations made it difficult for him to position himself where he could see clearly over the adults standing nearby. His mother, Sarah, tried to help, but the wheelchair was heavy and the crowded area made maneuvering difficult. James watched as frustration began to replace joy on Tommy's face. The boy had come so far to see the guards, and now he was struggling to get a proper view. Other tourists, though well-meaning, seemed unaware of the situation as they jostled for their own photographs and viewpoints. The caregivers were doing their best to help, but the growing crowd was making their job increasingly challenging. It was then that James made a choice that would define not only his career, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve. Moving almost imperceptibly at first, he shifted his position slightly, turning just enough to face Tommy more directly. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to most observers, but to Tommy, it was everything. The boy's face lit up with pure delight as he realized the guard was acknowledging him. Encouraged by this tiny breakthrough, James took another step that would have shocked his instructors. He caught Tommy's eye and gave the slightest nod, a gesture so small that many people missed it entirely, but those who saw it understood its significance immediately. The crowd began to murmur with surprise and appreciation. Never before had they witnessed a Queen's Guard break protocol, even in such a minor way. But James wasn't finished. As he looked around at the group of special needs children and elderly visitors, he saw Margaret struggling to see over the crowd from her position near the back. Her granddaughter Emma was trying to help, but at 87 and with her walking frame, Margaret simply couldn't get close enough to have a clear view of the ceremony she had dreamed of seeing her entire life. Making another decision that flew, in the face of his training, James took several deliberate steps toward the group. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what was happening. Even the regular tourists stopped taking photos, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The other guards on duty maintained their positions, but James could feel their surprise at his actions. When he reached the barrier, James did something that would be talked about for years to come. He knelt down to Tommy's eye level, bringing himself face to face with the excited boy. Tommy's mother gasped, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed this incredible act of kindness. The boy reached out tentatively, and James, still maintaining his dignified bearing, allowed Tommy to touch the golden buttons on his red tunic. The crowd erupted in whispers of amazement and appreciation. Cameras began clicking rapidly, but not in the usual tourist fashion. People were capturing something beautiful and unexpected, a moment when humanity triumphed over rigid protocol, when compassion became more important than rules. James then stood and walked over to Margaret, who was now openly crying with joy. He offered his arm to help steady her as she moved closer to the barrier, ensuring she had the perfect view she had waited a lifetime to experience. The elderly woman's hands shook as she reached out to briefly touch his uniform, a gesture that connected her to the history and tradition she had revered for so many years. Word of what was happening began to spread throughout the castle grounds, and more people gathered to witness this extraordinary scene. As word spread through the castle grounds about the guards' extraordinary actions, something magical began to happen. Other visitors, who had initially come simply as tourists, found themselves deeply moved by what they were witnessing. The atmosphere shifted from typical sightseeing to something much more profound, a shared human experience that transcended cultural and social barriers. James continued his gentle interactions with the special needs group, taking time with each person who needed extra attention. There was 8-year-old Lucy, who had Down syndrome and had been fascinated by the tall, fuzzy hat. When James noticed her curious stare, he carefully removed his bearskin hat and lowered it so she could see it up close. Her delighted giggle echoed across the courtyard, bringing smiles to faces throughout the crowd. An elderly gentleman named Robert, a war veteran himself, had been watching from his wheelchair with tears in his eyes. When James approached him, Robert managed to lift his shaking hand in a military salute. Without hesitation, James returned the salute with full military precision, a gesture that honored both the veterans' service and their shared understanding of duty and sacrifice. The moment was so moving that several onlookers began applauding spontaneously. The regular tourists, initially surprised by the break in protocol, soon realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Instead of feeling shortchanged by the deviation from normal procedure, they found themselves part of a story that was far more meaningful than any routine changing of the guard ceremony. Many put away their cameras, preferring to simply experience the moment rather than document it. Sarah, Tommy's mother, approached James with tears streaming down her face. She had been worried about bringing Tommy to such a formal, rigid environment, fearing he might be made to feel different or unwelcome. Instead, she was witnessing her son being treated with dignity, respect, and genuine kindness by someone who represented the very best of British tradition and values. The caregivers from the facility were equally moved. They dealt daily with a society that often overlooked or misunderstood their charges, and here was a symbol of authority and tradition, treating their people with extraordinary compassion. One caregiver named Patricia later said it was the most beautiful thing she had witnessed in her 20 years of working with special needs individuals. Other guards on duty began to notice the positive energy radiating from James's actions. While they maintained their positions and protocols, several began to make small gestures of their own. A slight smile, a barely perceptible nod, tiny acknowledgments that showed they understood and supported what their colleague was doing. The crowd had grown significantly as news of the guards' kindness spread through social media and word of mouth. People were coming not just to see the traditional ceremony, but to witness acts of human compassion that reminded everyone of what truly mattered. The castle grounds buzzed with positive energy and renewed faith in human decency. James knew that his actions were being recorded and photographed extensively. He understood that there might be consequences for breaking protocol, but in that moment, surrounded by joy and gratitude, he felt certain he was doing exactly what his role as a protector and servant of the people demanded. True service, he realized, sometimes required the courage to choose compassion over conformity. The special needs group's visit was scheduled to last only 30 minutes, but the magic of the moment seemed to suspend time itself. Children laughed, elderly visitors wept with joy, and caregivers marveled at the unexpected kindness they were witnessing. It was becoming clear that this day would be remembered not for its adherence to protocol, but for its beautiful deviation from it. News of James's compassionate actions spread far beyond the castle grounds with remarkable speed. Within hours, videos and photographs of the guards' interactions with the special needs visitors had gone viral on social media platforms around the world. The hashtag #DontMindGuardWithHeart began trending globally, with millions of people sharing the story and expressing their admiration for his actions. Major news networks picked up the story, with reporters rushing to Windsor Castle to cover what many were calling a beautiful example of humanity, triumphing over rigid tradition. The BBC, CNN, and news organizations across Europe, America, and beyond featured the story prominently, with anchors praising James's courage to choose compassion over protocol. Back at the castle, James's commanding officers faced an unprecedented situation. Technically, he had violated standing orders and broken centuries-old protocols. However, the overwhelming public response was so positive that any disciplinary action would likely create a public relations nightmare. More importantly, many of the officers found themselves genuinely moved by what James had done and questioned whether their rigid protocols needed reassessment. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, James's direct superior, called him into his office the following morning. James entered expecting the worst: potential demotion, transfer, or even discharge from the service. Instead, he found Harrison reviewing hundreds of emails, letters, and social media messages from around the world, all praising James's actions and thanking him for restoring their faith in human kindness. Among the messages was a particularly touching letter from Tommy's family. Sarah had written about how her son had been bullied at school and made to feel different and unwelcome in many public spaces. She described how James's kindness had shown Tommy that he was valued and respected, giving him confidence and joy that would last a lifetime. The letter was accompanied by a drawing Tommy had made of James in his red uniform, with the words, "My hero," written in crayon at the bottom. Margaret's granddaughter Emma had also written, explaining how her grandmother had spoken of nothing else since their visit. For Margaret, the experience had fulfilled a lifelong dream and created a memory that brought her immense joy during what were likely to be her final years. Emma wrote that her grandmother kept repeating, "That young man saw me as a person, not just an old lady in the way." The palace itself was monitoring the situation closely. Senior advisors were discussing how to respond to an incident that had captured the world's attention and generated overwhelmingly positive coverage for the royal family and British traditions. The Queen's private secretary had been fielding calls from international media and government officials, all wanting to comment on the story. James learned that several veteran organizations had reached out to express their support, saying his actions embodied the true spirit of military service, protecting and serving all people, especially those most vulnerable. Disability rights groups praised him for treating people with special needs with dignity and respect, while elderly care organizations thanked him for honoring older citizens who are often overlooked in society. The story had particularly resonated in other countries with similar ceremonial guards. The guards at Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, and even international counterparts in places like Greece and Denmark began receiving questions about whether they would show similar flexibility and compassion in their duties. James realized that his moment of decision at the castle barrier had created ripples that reached far beyond anything he could have imagined. What had started as a simple act of kindness had become a global conversation about the balance between tradition and humanity, about the true meaning of service and about the power of small gestures to create profound change. 3 weeks after that transformative day at Windsor Castle, James received the most unexpected summons of his military career. He was requested to appear at Buckingham Palace for a private meeting with senior palace officials. As he traveled to London, his mind raced with possibilities, still uncertain whether he was about to be commended or reprimanded for his actions. The meeting took place in an elegant room overlooking the palace gardens. Present were the Queen's private secretary, the commanding officer of all ceremonial guards, and several other officials whose presence indicated the highest levels of attention to this matter. To James's amazement, they informed him that his actions had been reviewed not just by military leadership, but had come to the personal attention of members of the royal family themselves. The officials explained that rather than face discipline, James was being recognized for embodying the true spirit of royal service. They had decided to implement new guidelines that would allow guards more flexibility in interacting with special needs visitors, elderly guests, and children, while still maintaining the dignity and security requirements of their positions. James's compassionate response had catalyzed a thoughtful evolution in centuries-old protocols. More remarkably, James learned that his story had inspired the creation of a new program. Special visiting days would be established at royal locations, specifically for groups serving people with disabilities, elderly care facilities, and children's charities. These visits would be designed to provide meaningful interactions while maintaining appropriate security and ceremonial standards. The palace had also received thousands of requests from around the world, asking how people could visit and experience the same kind of interaction James had provided. This had led to discussions about training programs that would help ceremonial guards better serve all members of the public, particularly those with special needs, or those for whom such visits held deep personal significance. James returned to Windsor Castle as something of a celebrity among his fellow guards. Rather than resentment, he found respect and curiosity from his colleagues, many of whom admitted they had been moved by the story and questioned their own adherence to rigid protocols. The culture within the guard units began to shift subtly toward a more human-centered approach to their ceremonial duties. Tommy and his family were invited back to Windsor Castle for a special private tour, where James, now off-duty, was able to spend time showing the boy around and explaining the history and traditions of the Queen's Guard. Tommy's confidence had grown immeasurably since their first meeting, and his mother reported that he now stood taller and spoke more confidently at school, often telling classmates about his friend the soldier. Margaret, the elderly woman who had waited a lifetime to see the guards, passed away peacefully 6 months later. Her granddaughter Emma wrote to James to tell him that her grandmother had spoken about their encounter almost daily until her death, describing it as one of the most meaningful experiences of her entire life. Emma had framed the photograph of Margaret with James and placed it prominently at the funeral service. The global impact of James's story continued to spread. Military units around the world began examining their own protocols, questioning whether rigid adherence to tradition sometimes prevented them from fulfilling their true purpose of serving people. Several countries implemented similar policy changes, allowing their ceremonial guards more discretion in human interactions while maintaining necessary security and dignity. James's actions had proven that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in following orders blindly, but in recognizing when compassion should guide decision-making. His split-second choice to prioritize human connection over protocol had touched millions of lives and created lasting positive change in institutions known for their resistance to change. Today, James continues to serve as a Queen's Guard, but his role has evolved. He frequently participates in the special needs visiting programs, has become an unofficial spokesperson for compassionate service, and mentors younger guards on balancing tradition with humanity. His story remains a powerful reminder that individual acts of kindness can create ripples of positive change that extend far beyond anything we might imagine, and that true honor sometimes requires the courage to break with convention in service of a higher calling.